Hello again. This is Digging Deep, or YEG's Development Chat. I'm Dave Onashenko.
I'm Raymond Sones.
And we're with Clarity Development Advisory, bringing you today's topic. We are talking all things parking. So we've got three topics: development, demand management, and districts. Parking. Why is that even relevant to development, planning?
That's almost a rhetorical question, I think, because it's at the core of cities and has been for the last 60 plus years. We've been there's been contention. There's been the ways in which parking and cars and everything have shaped cities, in fact, and it ties into how we develop different types of amenities in our city, to housing, to commercial sites, and it's just very prevalent. And
so land use being very tied to transportation,
mm-hmm.
and it's a component, it's an externality
Absolutely.
of a predominant transportation mode.
Mm-hmm.
And it can have externalities on how that land is used, how we interact with development, costs, lots of things.
And it's a cycle, right? Like it is the type of thing that it is generated, as you say, through like transportation and land use have this relationship that's not just one directional, right? It's transportation also dictates land use, just as land use dictates transportation. So they're inherently related and a great item for discussion. There's discussion happening right now at City Council in Edmonton about curbside management. We'll get into that a little bit. Just a couple of years ago, there were big discussions happening around things like parking minimums, and so it's constantly there. It's constantly something to be aware of, and is tied into development in every single development that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so why don't we'll jump right into it. We'll start with the first one, and we're going to talk about the first D,
mm-hmm.
development, as it relates to parking. And this is with the open option parking bylaw back from 2020. So prior to this, like lots of municipalities still have, and some are having that conversation on now.
Mm-hmm.
There were parking minimums, and then maximums later on in
mm-hmm.
the bylaw in Edmonton for development. So minimum number for residential and commercial and everything else. June 23rd, 2020, at council, the open option parking bylaw is in front of council and voted on. And so what it does is remove the minimum parking requirements from the bylaw.
Mm-hmm.
And this was great. I mean, I was a huge advocate for this.
Mm-hmm.
There was parking strategy discussions. What should they do? And my argument always back was, let the market decide.
Mm-hmm.
Let the person building the project. If anyone from a homeowner wants to build a house and doesn't want to provide parking, well, that's on him, and maybe he loses some people he would attract with
mm-hmm.
having the parking. Versus, say, a business too. If you build a commercial business and have limited parking, some businesses might see that as an asset. Others say they don't want part of it. But allowing the market to decide. And then obviously there's citywide implications, there's street parking implications, mm-hmm. but this is the direction the city moved. There still is maximums, right?
In transit-oriented sites.
Yeah.
That's about it.
But otherwise, minimums have been removed. And, it's only been a couple of years, so I imagine the city's going to look back at this and say, like, what have we learned from this?
Mm-hmm.
How much was built? Parking was built? Like, great examples would be, say, and we saw this with some of our clients with multifamily projects,
mm-hmm.
right? And they're being forced, in some cases, they're going down 3, 4, 5 levels to put in parking, to the costs of, 50, 60, 100 grand per stall. It was costing the deeper you go down, right?
Well, and that's the crux of the issue, right? It is that individual cost. Even 5-10 years ago, we were already talking about an underground stall in one level down being $45,000 to build.
Yeah.
And that cost, as you said, escalates as the further you have to go down. And this conversation is shifting, right? Like it's something that, again, 10 years ago, we were having the discussion about, is it 1.5, 2 stalls required per residential unit?
Yeah.
Versus now we're seeing a whole lot more of developers looking to build 0.5 per unit.
Sure.
As a lot of their potential tenants will be taking advantage of transit, or they perhaps they street park, or.
So let's talk about that for a second, and that will bleed into some of our
Yeah.
other things here in the future. But I'm all for letting the market decide, because I think some people then choose or don't choose to, say, rent or purchase a product or whatever, maybe based on that, right? There was one developer I remember said, hey, we find that our tenants need X amount of parking stalls, and they're looking for more than we're able to provide. And for them, building more parking made sense. And others say, you know what? We don't want the added expense. We think we're going to build a great product and we'll attract tenants regardless. What about that externality factor? You don't provide enough parking for the demand of your tenants, or for your, if it's commercial, for their customers, and that spills out onto the adjacent neighborhoods, the residential neighborhoods, commercial neighborhoods. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, there's areas where, and I'm talking about areas that are unmanaged, so they're not, there's no meters on it or anything else, where the neighborhood bears the brunt of that parking.
I mean, at the crux, what is a street parking stall? It's a shared asset. It's something that is produced by the municipality,
right?
And who takes ownership of that? I mean, we get into challenges about the parking space in front of people's houses all the time, especially in commercial areas.
Sure.
Does that individual have more right to that parking space than somebody who is shopping in that district right now, or the multifamily tenant just down the road?
Right.
And so it's a challenging conversation, because shared asset completely. Is that the type of externality that, say, you live next to 124th Street in Edmonton, you're one block off that street, so you get the advantages of that street, and so is that the type of sort of expense that you have to face now, because you get that advantage back as well?
Sure.
It's complicated, and there's no one right way to do it, but what I will say is that we are seeing a trend across North America, and Shirley, if you don't mind pulling up the image we have here, I think this is a map by Strong Towns, which is a great online urbanist webpage, and it's showing, what you're seeing here is the cities across North America that have changed, reduced, removed altogether parking minimums.
So red dots being ones where they've removed minimums altogether.
Yeah.
And then orange dots being for the city center district, where there's restrictions, things like that, scaling. But you had said this map, this is progress as of right now.
Yeah.
This map looked very different. When Edmonton did this 2 years ago, they were one of the lone dots, right?
There were not that many dots on the map at that point in time. In fact, I don't know if there were any in Canada at that time, other than Edmonton. But we're seeing this shift happening, and so there's so many different lenses you can take. We could talk about this for hours and hours. The crux of this being, though, is it parking that drives your city, or is it the type of land and things on your land that you want to see that drives your city? And
this is often, it's a misconception. We've seen lots of evidence for this, and we'll talk a little bit about the parking genius himself, Donald Shoup, and the high cost of free parking. We'll throw up. We've got his little book here. We'll throw that up in a second. Oh, yeah, here it is. Right here. So this is like the Bible of parking and automotive infrastructure, and looking at a lot of the studies and externalities and costs and everything else, and what free parking, especially, what it does. So this conversation comes up all the time with parking, and you'll see, like, say a small rural town and they want to drive their business development district downtown, and they say, hey, we need to put some more parking, that's going to do it, right? No one drove downtown for a parking, right?
No.
But they might, the feedback might be, I don't drive to this old city center district because of parking. You hear that in Edmonton.
Yeah.
I don't drive because I have to pay for parking.
Yeah.
Well, that might be what is said, but what is also behind that is I don't drive because there isn't something motivating me to go there.
Or just simply the lack of alternatives.
Exactly.
Right? Like if our transit system isn't up to par and this is my only option to get down there, it's just too many barriers. I have to pay for that now. I have to find a parking spot now. And there's just those types of challenges. But I will go back a little bit to kind of the crux of where this discussion on open option parking happened, especially in Edmonton. We were having this issue of who is being impacted actually by parking minimums. Is it the property owner, the developer, or is it the ultimate tenant? Well, it's a mix of both because the way that it was designed was that parking minimums were attached to particular land uses. So you would have restaurants, like small restaurants, for example,
Absolutely.
needing to have one parking stall per 10 meters squared of, I don't know what it was, I'm making that up, but 10 meters squared of restaurant floor area. And so they were coming to a potential lease and saying, okay, based on the city's zoning, we need to have 62 stalls. Oh shoot, we're on White Avenue. Where are we going to get 62 stalls? So they're going through this process, having to get a variance now, and the city's pushing back, community is pushing back, and so you're just having these challenges coming up. And so a lot of great business opportunity beyond just development, but the actual tenants of those spaces was being removed. And we're seeing a massive difference now, and we're talking about tons of great, like, you know, anything from small cafes to like your board game shop to your whatever it is, aren't having to think about that now.
Yeah.
And they know their clients, right?
Yeah.
They know how their clients want to get to these spaces. It shouldn't necessarily, that onus shouldn't be on them to like go out and say now, oh well, we don't have enough parking.
Right.
Like we had this with the Artery. I don't know if you remember those guys. Yeah.
And I remember Woodwork before they set up. They were looking at some places in the quarters, for example. Same thing. They needed 40 stalls, and it's surrounded by all this, non-accessory surface parking lots. But there's parking everywhere. They're like, well, you need the parking
for your individual site.
Ridiculous. But it's good. I mean, it reduces some of the red tape for these businesses, for development projects too. Yeah. And the city's effectively said, if we approve this land use here, we know there are some components tied to parking and transportation, and we think that's fine in this area. Yeah. So 2 years into it, I think it's been great so far. I'd love for the city to look back in, another 8 years and say, what are some of these metrics comparing, what had happened before? Accelerated permit time, some of the benefits, types of projects that got built, average number of stalls per unit.
Just certainty for tenants who have no idea that there's parking minimums when they're trying to open a business. How would they know that?
Exactly. Okay, good stuff.
So, cool.
Let's move on to the second one here. So the second D of all things parking is demand management. So the Curbside Management Strategy is something that's at council right now that they've been talking about. They were talking about it last month. And, it's this process of being, rolled out, and there's, 7 action items.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read too much into this. Do you want to give a quick rundown?
Sure. I mean, 7 action items that influence the use and management of curbside spaces and public parking. So everything talking about, say, this curbside space from accessibility to bike lanes to traffic management to a bunch of things. 2 that I wanted to focus on in this next segment here is the demand management side. Okay. So, Donald Shoup, for example, high cost of free parking, talked a bit about this. Great example. I think we've got a graphic from San Francisco that talked a little bit about this, and they referenced Donald Shoup too. So before, this is talking about open spaces and kind of the dynamic pricing integration. So you would have a full block, say at a set price, and it's underpriced, right?
Yep.
But as soon as they were able to implement more dynamic pricing, that says, hey, when there's high demand for street parking, we're going to raise those rates a bit, and that's going to create more turnover. People are going to go to off-street stalls. They're going to look for maybe other ways to get downtown, and that opens up more stalls for more people to park.
Yeah. So to give a sort of an analogy or an example of how this works, like we're seeing this throughout society beyond the world of development. It's your Uber. It's your surge pricing on Uber, right?
Yeah.
How it's reactive to what's being experienced on the ground, and pricing can be raised, it can be lowered. There's probably certain, like, this can be applied based on certain minimum metrics that you need to achieve as a municipality.
And the difference with Uber, though, part of that is to motivate additional drivers to get out, right, and supply the demand. In the case of parking, it's a fixed amount of stalls, but based on whatever the demand is for, say, if there's a concert nearby, or as we saw during the pandemic, the prices of parking stalls dropped. It was nil for a while, but then it dropped to an absolute minimum because that demand wasn't there, right?
Yep. I mean, I'm still like occasionally driving downtown and finding spots that, I'm going into the Edmonton ePark app, and it turns out it's free right now because there's nobody downtown still.
Exactly. So the ability, that's one great way for demand management, how you can influence that. You can encourage more turnover of stalls, or you can say, hey, park here as opposed to there, or whatever else, right?
Sure. And I think we just had that image up on the screen of the Edmonton new-ish now parking meter system, but it's kind of these technological approaches that can help us get there. I mean, 10 years ago we had parking meters in our streets, and nothing like that would have ever been possible.
No, it was a fixed cost. There are these mechanical meters and whatnot. So this is great. I mean, you can do it on there, or you can do it straight from your phone, which I do. What I always forget to do is when I leave is to actually quit the parking, so I get the notice that
you pay all day basically for 1 hour of parking.
Figuring that out, maybe like updating the app so it notices as you're moving outside of a geofenced area.
Sure.
Hey, City of Edmonton, you hear that? That would be great. Granted, you might like the revenue too, so who knows?
Yeah, I don't know if they'll be on top of that.
Another thing that they're talking about, so updates, they're talking about this fluctuating on demand is one of their action items.
Okay.
So probably maybe a little more dynamic than it is right now. I don't know how dynamic it is compared to what they're interested in. The second is updating the current residential parking program. So some of this too would be more, what do you call it?
Like permits?
Permits, thank you. Tags.
Tags.
Permits for residents in certain areas. So saying, hey, residents can park here in some of these high demand areas where people are parking and walking to LRT stations or to the university or whatnot. And you can have a tag or two if you don't have parking. Or you have guests that come over and want to park in front or something, right? So this is something that works, and as there's more and more strains on this open public parking in certain areas, the city's exploring maybe more areas for some of this. So again, it's demand management as well.
What's the controversy here, though? With like, what are the arguments against parking tags?
Well, I mean, for one, at the heart of it, a lot of people have this idea, and I'm going to say falsely placed because it comes up at council all the time, and I understand where this comes from, but that the space in front of their property should be available to them primarily. And if not, should just be open and easily accessible. So it's a bit of a barrier, and it limits some of the things that people actively are using some of their space for right now. Maybe they're parking their RV in front, or a couple vehicles, or whatever it is.
And again, circling back to the open option thing, we heard this all the time during that discussion as well. I mean, maybe some of us are guilty of that as well, but in our garages, we've got everything else than our vehicles, and we want to have the stall in front of our house for our vehicle. So how does this work then, right? Like,
You know, there's we don't have an image of it, but if you search it up, this is really big. It's a thing in Chicago, and
Oh, yeah.
especially when they get their
Yeah.
giant snow dumps, like off the
Yeah.
lake, right?
Yeah.
They'll get like 2 feet or something, and tons, like the parking constraints there are even more so in some of these older, mature areas.
Yeah.
And so people will spend 30 minutes shoveling out that parking stall right in front of their spot,
Yeah.
but there's no way to control it. So people put like old furniture and chairs and cones there, saying like
Like you're claiming space.
exactly.
Yeah, this is
I
mine.
shoveled
Yeah.
it. I did the
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
I know I don't own it, but I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And then when people park there, there's some of these revenge videos where people bury
yeah.
the car
Yeah.
in snow as a result. I'm not encouraging that by any means, so don't do that. But it shows how people feel, entitled to it. In that case, because they did some work, but the tie that we have to this space in front of
Yeah.
our place, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, like it's funny how much physical space, if you think about it, compared to even the size of your own residence, that is, right? Like
Oh yeah.
right. Like
Yeah,
oftentimes
it
it's
takes a lot of
half
space.
or more.
At the heart of it, though, and this is what comes up sometimes that I want to hammer home, is that the roads that exist throughout the city, it's a jointly owned community asset, right?
Mhm.
It is infrastructure that belongs to the city as a whole and all the residents.
Yeah.
So when the road's getting paved in front of your place or someone else's, yes, it benefits them because they live right there, but it benefits all of us because we all can use it.
Correct.
And so just based on proximity, we think of the area in and around our place of residence as kind of more ours than someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
But
Which is understandable.
Sure.
Completely.
Sure. Yeah, in a nomadic lifestyle, we set up our tent here and this is our area. Sure. But at the end of the day, we benefit from this collectively. What it means, though, is sometimes we have to sacrifice what's right in front of us a little bit for that collective benefit.
Sure.
And it's hard to take that approach at times, too.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it easier for me to park or have access to a certain area if it means that you have to give that up, or there's payment now for that area, or hey, you're going to benefit because I'm not going to clog up this street with me and 30,000 other university students as we try to park here for free and avoid taking transit and everything else. There's trade-offs.
Lots of trade-offs, and that's where coming back to the parking tag thing.
Yeah.
Maybe we realize that we need a program like this because maybe these are smaller households here or smaller lots, multifamily, row housing, things like that where you may not even have the opportunity to have your garage anyways. So
and as the city grows, this is a continuing trend, right? We see this as a bigger issue in larger cities.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why some of the alternatives that they discuss in here, some of the alternatives to non-motorized traffic or alternatives to single-occupant automotive traffic, so your busing, your LRT, it's good. And that's something that has to go hand in hand. If you're going to restrict some of the components of automotive traffic, make some of those other aspects of transportation easier.
So that ties right into the next one, which is parking benefit districts. This is number 3. And so we called it districts, but really we wanted to talk about parking benefit districts, going back to the sort of Donald Shoup model and looking at some of the things that he's proposed. When he's the father of
the guru.
Yeah, the guru of open option type parking and all these kind of things, but he always tied it in to the idea of the parking benefit district as well.
Okay.
And
so what is that?
Yeah, this is the idea that so yes, we're already doing the dynamic pricing. So we have a pricing model that's dictating what our demand kind of looks like, and then we're actually taking in specific areas. So for example, like 124th Street, so a commercial area where there's sort of high demand for like visitors to the space, and we're drawing a line around that area,
Okay.
and saying that revenue from street parking, so city-owned parking stalls, effectively, can be redirected back into sort of active mode infrastructure in that area.
Okay.
So that might look like, bike lanes, or that might look like improved pedestrian experiences, improved crosswalks, bike parking. That might look like, on the flip side, it might look like taking a couple of stalls and paying into some patio space for some of the businesses out there. And so you're kind of redirecting those very localized, like the impacts of that localized driving back into that community. And so we see that, like, this isn't a new concept. It's not a novel concept. We have business improvement areas across Canada that effectively get the same thing, but not from a parking perspective. Everybody has a levy on their property, and that's redirected back into safety and into attractiveness and into marketing for the area and everything else.
So this is, and we talked a little bit about this in a different context, this is a form of a localized user tax. So we talked about that in terms of development projects as a way of funding kind of a capital stack, right?
Sure.
Loans that are paid back through a localized user tax. Same idea. And it could be even front-ended too, where the city might borrow against future revenues to do some pedestrian improvements, and it might be kind of like, we've seen in like control revitalization levies, right?
Yep.
So they'd have to model that out, obviously. I love the idea. I love the idea if there is demonstrable benefits that are shown, and you say, hey, these benches and trees and this bike lane and crossing features were all as a result of this.
Well, and I think that's how it would be, right? Because it would be a fund. Rather than just going into general coffers, it's a directed fund.
And that's my concern, though, because
that's what's happening right now.
Right.
Right. Like,
well,
you're parking so it's a completely different concept. You're saying that money gets immediately redirected into a fund that is only for that.
So I guess a concern would be, though, what happens if they say, oh, actually, we're going to use this for all infrastructural investment in the area now, too. So the street has to get repaved in this area. We're actually going to use it from this.
So, I mean, the model has always been focused on stakeholder input.
Yeah.
And so that might be your local business improvement area. That might be residents of the area, businesses, etc. And the model has been very sort of focused on kind of the grassroots engagement in terms of the ultimate use of those funds. So thinking these are the people who experience the space the most and are most directly impacted by parking,
right?
If you think of it that way, and so they should have some decision-making power.
Absolutely. It's good. And at the end of the day, I mean, one thing, Donald Shoup again talks about high cost of free parking. The provision of on-street parking is not free. It's something we collectively pay for. So it's really it is a subsidized benefit. So when people say, I should have the ability to park here for free, well, we make our roads wider to allow for street parking in front of your house or in front of a business and all that. And who pays for that wider road, for the maintenance of that wider road? We all do.
Yep, we're all doing that. Yep.
So there needs to be that understanding that it's already a cost, and so charging users for it isn't the worst thing in the world. That being said, the argument comes full circle sometimes when it's directed at, say, you have people who are not cyclists, and they say, well, cyclists should have a user fee or whatever else, right? At the end of the day, we make decisions collectively as a city as to the type of city we want, some of the benefits of that, some of the benefits of having access to parking or reduced automotive traffic or more active modes or better pedestrian experiences. And it's a complex system. And some of these things we talked about today all feed into that. Yeah. So the problem is a lot of this thing, especially when it comes to, the war on cars or whatever.
Oh, you shouldn't have said that. We're going to get flagged.
Exactly. the language is meant to be divisive, but it isn't. This is a holistic city building issue that each of these components, these modes, these components of parking for automotive and charging, like they all play into building a great city.
Certainly, and a very good way of looking at this, if you ask me, is when in Edmonton, the open option parking discussion was supported by every stakeholder group in industry, in the development industry specifically, and so usually you'll find it the other way around, where it's like community saying one thing, industry saying another. Everybody was on board with this.
So the community leagues were as well?
Generally, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Because everybody's looking at this and saying, okay, this restricts good city building, and it restricts some of the things that development is trying to do, which doesn't. Those things aren't necessarily separate.
Yeah.
They can be the same goal, just looked at from a different lens. Yeah. So kind of an interesting way of looking at this when you've got industry supporting, like virtually unanimous support. Yeah.
Well, as geeky as talking about parking is when it relates to city building, here we are, and we've spent the past half an hour doing it. Thank you very much for joining us. Again, we will remind you, we do this every second week here on Wednesdays at 12:10. Feel free to join us live and put comments in the chat.
Yep.
Otherwise, throw comments up on the videos after. We'd love to respond and give feedback.
Totally.
And again, other ideas of topics you want to hear us talk about, or even want to talk on the show if you're in the industry. These are all things we're open to.
Yeah.
Great.
That's
Thanks,
awesome.
Raina. It was fun. We'll see you guys next time.